live series, Ogechi Ekianyawo. And on weekends, we talk about the impact of the pandemic in Nigeria. Today, we're focusing on the impact of COVID on the workforce, and we'll specifically be looking at managing the workforce in the pandemic that has caused furloughs, closures, and normalized the concept of working from home. Again, as we say during these times, this is unprecedented. These are uncharted paths. And a lot of the insights we'll gain will be in retrospect. Still, it is important to look at the trends and patterns that we can already see. Today, joining us is Onyeka Aghatise. Onyeka is an HR professional with over a decade of HR generalist and specialist experience in business partnering, organizational design, project and change management, talent management, data analytics, across many geographies. She has worked in various multinational organizations, successfully partnering with diverse business leaders to translate business objectives into HR initiatives that improve performance, growth, and employee engagement and business value. Onyeka Aghatise, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much, Oge. Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you clearly. So we just talking generally, can you just give us a broad picture of how the workplace dynamics have been affected by COVID-19, by the pandemic?
Okay, so
can you hear me?
I can hear you. I lost you in the middle, but I think you were saying something around what the impact is of COVID-19 on the workplace.
Exactly.
And I think, at this point, it's still a bit too early to understand the full impact of COVID-19. Not just on the workplace, but on the nature of work itself. So businesses right now, what they're grappling with is managing that balance between financial, operational challenges that have come as a result of COVID, with also being able to rapidly respond to changes in regulatory environment, as well as the requirements of their employees as the first and primary concern, but also of their customers and suppliers. And so I think in that sense, what the full impact is still left to be seen for a little bit. Having said that, there is no doubt in my mind, and I think in the mind of many people, that COVID will be a catalyst for what is going to be the future of work. What we've seen is a lot of cost consciousness, a lot of speed and agility with people responding to the pandemic, and a lot of what we thought would not be possible in the past, all of a sudden becoming possible. So we've seen that at the minimum, the one thing that we can say without a shadow of a doubt is that this is a huge catalyst. But to be more specific on some of the things, because we can already see some trends, and I think the biggest one or biggest shift, as it were, is that adoption of remote working practices, something that is not quite prevalent in Nigeria. I think there's a lot of trust around that basis. If you look at it now, companies are looking to the future. They're looking towards how can we leverage doing work outside of our primary residence, outside of our offices where it's possible. There was a study done, I think 2 or 3 weeks ago. It wasn't just Nigeria, I think it was across Africa. And about 71% of organizations are looking at adopting some form of remote working practices going forward. So people are already thinking actually post-COVID, and I know I say that quite with a bit of reservation because what is post-COVID? But post-COVID, we will start looking at adopting remote working and flexible working practices. So that's happening. Something that's also linked to that is a change in the mental model of business owners and line managers, especially in Nigeria. There is a huge proclivity of people to equate presence in an office with performance. So if I'm in the office 10 hours, 12 hours a day, I'm a performer. It doesn't matter if I'm on Linda Ikeji's blog or I'm on Facebook, so long as I'm in the office. And what this has meant for us in terms of a shift is we now have to go beyond, are you in an office, to what is the outcome? And it requires a lot of work upfront from businesses, right? You have to clearly articulate what is expected from you as an employer. I have to be I need to delineate what are the activities and what is the outcome. But I think what we will see as a result of that is that people are then, and line managers and employees are then clearer on the scope of their jobs, but also easier able to, or more objectively, maybe not easier, but more objectively able to assess and measure performance going forward as a result of that. I think another thing that has potentially shifted in that dynamic is health and safety. So the obligation of employers to assure health and safety. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that employers do not before now have an obligation to work to health and safety. But depending on the industry you're in, health and safety has not always taken center stage. So if you're in a deeply technical manufacturing, FMCG, that type of industry, yes, health and safety, there's hazards and risks deeply entrenched in your job. So health and safety is quite important. But if you're typically maybe a bank, office service consulting based employer, or just a tech startup that doesn't have a lot of inherent risk in the workplace, then the obligation has grown, because if you're going to continue to have people to come into offices, then there's a lot of requirements on employers to assure that people are able to stay safe, people are able to reduce exposure, etc. And then perhaps the other thing is technology, right? It's been probably the glue that has held everything together, not just in terms of helping people rapidly respond to trying to mitigate the risk that we're seeing with COVID, but also keeping people connected. As I said earlier, one of the biggest shifts we've seen is people now working remotely.
Yeah.
How do these people stay connected? There's all sorts of collaborative tools. I mean, we're talking on Zoom right now, and I have to be honest with you, before beginning of this year, I didn't know what Zoom was. So there's a lot more adoption, and some of these are free to some degree, depending on the type of optionality you want to have with those. So technology has really played a huge role. And just before I sort of stop on that, I think the biggest one, or maybe the last one, is now then we're seeing governments begin to play a role in private sector employment. I think this is globally, it's not just Nigeria, right? Earlier today, I was watching the news, and there was a debate around whether or not the American stimulus checks will continue. And that's what has actually kept workers able to continue to focus on work, even when they've not been able to get into work. The same with the UK and Canada, where furloughed employees are being paid a percentage of their salary, or a percentage of their salary is being guaranteed by employers. And even in Nigeria, so the government has rolled out, I think, palliative to about 11 million Nigerians who are on the National Social Register. We could argue about whether or not that is very representative of the group of people who are really impacted, but it is involvement nonetheless. And I think that's the biggest change we've seen. So a lot of changes in terms of just how we work, a lot of the responsiveness in terms of speed, a different requirements in terms of the employee-employer relationship, including things like obligation around health and safety. And then obviously we're increasingly seeing the government play in that space. So yeah, a huge shift, but what that becomes eventually, I think, is something that we still have to see with the evolution of this pandemic.
Yeah, so some of the things that I noted, I mean, just you speaking now, is just working from home and the inability, or, I mean, right now we can't find managers or line managers or supervisors micromanaging their staff anymore because they're working from home. So, I mean, just working as an HR personnel, do you think that productivity has dropped?
So, I mean, it's a very, my answer is actually very ambiguous, because you started off by saying we don't see managers micromanaging. I think we've seen now a new, and I don't know, there's no term that has been coined to represent it, but I do see a bit of micromanaging happening. And I think it's because I can't physically see you. If I'm not getting an email from you every 5 minutes, or a text message to say something has been sold, depending on what you're doing, I'm not sure whether or not you're working. So there's that, but I won't, delve into that a bit. At the beginning, a lot of research, McKinsey, Deloitte, all of the big fours, they've all sort of done research to say, okay, well, actually, there's a lot of productivity that has peaked. And I think initially people were doing what was best to keep things going, but it required a lot of energy, a lot of emotional investment, a lot of flexibility on part of both employees and employers to get that going. It required much more than is required in the steady state. And so what we're now seeing is maybe the reverse of that, where people just can't continue in the current state, be it having to meet curfew but still being able to go to work, for instance, in Lagos State, or paying exorbitant amounts to try and get internet that maybe works half of the time or doesn't work, or sacrificing child or elder care to be able to deliver at the office. So there's a wide array of stuff that is now being reprioritized, and where productivity then begins to suffer.
Yeah, so I mean, when you say that, it just puts coming to my mind is the pressure that employees are facing now in ways that test their well-being and even their private lives. So how can an employee maintain their social and personal well-being in the light of working from home and trying to balance, well, their home front and then their responsibilities at work?
Yeah, so I think one of the big things that is having this impact that you mentioned on well-being is change. So it's one of the biggest hazards. So if you take out sort of physical hazards and threats to your physical being as an employee, change is one of the biggest causes of stress for employees. And I mean, 2020, if it had a tagline, it would be the year of change. There's lots of people needing to revisit their normal ways of working, etc. And I think to be able to answer that question, you need to bucket the employees. So not everyone has the same experience, and not everyone is stressed, or for lack of a better term, not stressed in the same way. So the first group of people are people who are either frontline, essential, or just required physically in an office. So they're still having to go to work anyway. And I think the stress that they feel is different, right? There's that additional, am I exposing myself by continuously going out every day? There's also the guilt of, I'm going out every day and I'm exposing people that I live with, my family. I mean, there are people who live with elderly parents who are in a group that you said, this is a demographic that is actually more hit or more hard hit. Or maybe you have a spouse or someone who lives with you who has a pre-existing condition that when it lends itself to COVID is more disastrous. Then there's that additional guilt of, am I putting that additional risk on my family? I don't have the money to get a different place, so I'm going to have to manage this risk every day. And there's so much precaution that needs to be taken on a daily basis, which then exacerbates that. The other thing is, if you're physically in an office, especially when there are other people who maybe are working remotely. So if you're a practical employer, you'll say, okay, these jobs need to be done physically. I can't do them. You have to do them in the office. And these ones, people can work from home. The reality is that there's undue pressure on people who are in the office, right? Because there's some things that if you're working remotely, you just can't do if you're not in the office. So that's increased workload. The other thing that could potentially lead to that increased workload is maybe you have people who have pre-existing conditions that should be in the office that are not there, or they've traveled and now are social distancing or quarantining, depending on what exposure that they've had, etc. So you have that increased workload. And then everyone is tense. Different things are happening. There's job security, there's uncertainty. The dollar to the naira is doing a ping pong every day. So there's a lot of stress, and that's heightened. So if I'm an employee in a customer facing role, what am I getting from my customers or my clients? And how is my employer able to sort of mitigate any additional risk from that? Not just the risk of now COVID, but just in terms of people's irritation factor. We've seen all sorts of funny memes of people getting upset at salespeople telling them to wear masks or telling them to stand in a certain place in a line. And that's happening. It's happening in banks. I saw a picture on Twitter, I think it was a month ago, of people sort of getting upset with a security guard at a bank because he was asking him to sort of line up. And it's just a sign of the time. So how are we making sure that that's not happening? And then the second group of people that you're sort of looking at are those who are, well, lucky enough to still have a job, but then they're now working from home. And I think those group of people, almost everyone thinks, well, you should be fine. You're not even having to commute. You can wake up at 8, I don't know, at 7:59 to start work at 8, but the reality is they have a significant being able to interact with colleagues, share ideas, quickly just grab 5 minutes here or there to be able to have a quick conversation, to sitting in front of a computer. And that actually is one of the leading exacerbates depressions and feeling of sort of anxiety. The other thing is you're working in a new environment, and I think a lot of people take it, but the reality is you haven't used it for this purpose before. It may not even be set up for that purpose. You don't have a place to sit. You are now unable to detach your work and home life. So there's a big challenge with that. And I think the last group of people so there's a group of people who are either they've lost their job as a result of the pandemic, or they've been temporarily laid off because in the business that they support, there's no demand and therefore there's no revenue to pay them with. And for these people, they lose structure. So the structure that you had around going to work every day and having a sense of purpose, you lose that. And then, or they have that additional burden of, oh my God, am I still going to have a job? How do I pay my bills? I have people who are depending on me. And that's a big issue. If you sort of put all of that together with people's normal requirements of taking care of kids, taking care of family, then that becomes a really, really, really big ticking time bomb where people are then, you'll begin to see some of the mental health and well-being challenges. And in terms of sort of solutions or what can we do, I say work within your sphere of control or within your sphere of influence. You can't boil the ocean, and you can't solve world hunger. So I think for employers, it's the little things. I think the biggest one is communication. I think the nature of work, employee-employer relationships have significantly changed. You know, I won't, you know, sort of name the company, but a company recently said, look, you know, the way things are, we're not in the essential requirements. So we haven't gotten any aid from the Nigerian government because there's some requirements you need to meet to be able to get some aid, and we don't have enough revenue, so we need to lay people off. So let's have a conversation. Do you think we pay you guys 50% and everybody stays? The fact that you have that procedural justice, I feel like I'm part of the solution. This isn't being done to me. So that communication is extremely key. Making sure that people understand, even if the end is you don't have a job, there is respect. And you as an employer, you have shown whatever value that you have in your brand, that this is the approach that you have, because there will be recovery, and you really want people to remember what you did. Actually, whether or not you want it, people will remember what you did in the time when, you know, the stakes were down. I think the other thing is making sure that we get our managers trained to identify mental health concerns, and don't assume changes in productivity are an indication that someone is just slacking or not doing the right thing. And whenever you say this to people, they say, well, it costs so much money. Actually, there's quite a lot of free mental first aid training online, and there's some that are actually quite good quality that you can find within the region of 5,000 to 10,000 naira. So you can identify one at least person who you can train, because it's important that you train them to be able to identify and manage their own well-being, but also to be able to identify that in employees, and so that they are aware when there are changes in that area. And I think also continuity of a job. If people are going to continue to work, let them know what they're contributing to the business. Let them know what that impact is. If you have staff that are coming to the office, do everything within your power to mitigate every risk. You know, what if you need to put plexiglass, if you need to enforce that your clients, if you're client facing or customer facing, wear masks when they come in, or socially distance, do that to ensure that your employees feel that there's that value in them and their lives and their exposure. Make sure that you create an environment that people are able to share any concerns that they may have. So people, you know, may not want to speak up, even though there are inherent concerns in terms of they've identified some issues with mental health, as you say, or exposure that they haven't actually flagged before. You have to give them that opportunity. And then with employees working from home, it's also making sure that you stay connected. You give them the opportunity to assess their environment. So a lot of people don't take ergonomic health as serious, right? But if you do look at the research, the leading cause of disability of working age below 45 is actually back pain linked to poor posture when you're sitting. So a lot of us are sitting in the same area, and I'll put my hands up. I've actually done that. Sit for 4 hours, don't move, you're not sitting on the right type of chair. It's little things in terms of showing the value of that employee. And I think employers can do that. As an employee, be very protective of your personal space and of your mental health. Know when to stop. Have the conversation. A lot of time, a big part of it is actually in the fear of having the conversation. Have the conversation. If you have a child able to work until 1 p.m., but I promise you I'll be able to deliver such and such if I'm able to work between. So try and bring those ideas to the fore. So that's on your part as an employee, and explore the options. As you said at the beginning, and I know this word has been overflogged. It's unprecedented. We've not been in this situation before. So no one is the expert at dealing with a global pandemic. A lot of things have been disrupted by this pandemic, supply chains, demand, currencies, etc. So really just being open to having a dialogue and seeing what works for us, where can we meet each other in the middle.
Yeah. So all I can hear now is really these organizations adapting and adopting 21st century skills. We want them to be more empathetic towards their employers. and then you want them to just be more compassionate in understanding that the situations have changed, times have changed, and they need to take that into consideration. So just to follow up on flexibility, what would you consider to be flexible? Because all of this is in my head, and you're saying sometimes we can say work from so time, but some organizations or some duties or roles cannot afford that form of flexibility. How do companies manage that? Because you see, it's still a business concern, right? And the expectations from the employer, from the employee. So how do we handle that in that regard? Especially this question really relates, for me, it's more about women because now they're the primary caregivers and they're the ones, I mean, we've seen several research saying that they're the ones bearing the brunt of this pandemic in the sense that they have primary caregiving roles. So how do we manage that?
So I think it's two sides, right? There's the job itself and whether it lends itself to any flexibility. There's some jobs that don't. I mean, the guy who checks you for metals when you enter any of the banks can't do that from home. I mean, obviously we can try and automate it. He can't do that from home. So there's that understanding of what can be done. So that's the first step. Say, okay, let's look at this job, let's assess it, and let's see really what's the flexibility. But I think the biggest thing is thinking outside the box. I used an example just now in terms of don't, sorry, I see a question coming in on the chat. That was a distraction. Yeah, so in terms of don't think of the normal ways of doing things. So for instance, if we're saying I'm an employee, I'm female, my child is now home having to do Zoom classes because Lagos State, for instance, has said no children should go to school and all schools should be closed. Mm-hmm. As an employer, remember what I said about shifting your mental model around what leads to productivity. Have that conversation to say, okay, what do I need from you? Not when do I need it, or when do I need you to be working, or when do I need you sitting in front of a laptop? In the month of August, as an example, what do I need from you and how does that tie to the business? And I think there is a bit of upfront realism that employees themselves have to do, right? You have to understand that your personal situation is your personal situation, needs to be respected by your employer, but it may create a situation where it's more difficult for you to do things and therefore maybe less opportunities for you. And you need to be okay with that. So again, I said, this is sort of it's a conversation between both, right? As an employer, work within as much as is possible to allow employees still be able to contribute, but also as an employee, be very realistic around what your situation is and what those limitations are. Some employers have actually have done some sort of innovative stuff around. I know some people who have worked, they work 1 to 3 and then they work 4 to 7. So I've seen really sort of interesting ways of addressing this and being very flexible in getting that. And I think if that employee is delivering, then it should be okay.
Should be okay. So I have a question from one of the viewers, right? How can business owners boost worker morale within this pandemic? I think that you've touched on it and you've talked about communication and all of that, but do you have any more pointers?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I think it's also very important. So I talked about communication and I think it still is communication, but maybe I need to sort of delve in a little bit. So right now you sort of walk into a team meeting, you can tell with nonverbal cues who's in a good mood, who's happy with the direction of whatever decision you've just come to. And you lose that when you're sort of remote or you're not in that pandemic. I think really replacing that social interaction with something virtual is very important. So some people are doing things like having TGI Fridays on, thank God it's Friday, on Zoom, and not talking about work. You know, doing things like, okay, we're going to do a pop quiz on this particular individual today, just making sure that you continue to build that team culture. Whatever the team culture that you've worked so hard to establish, like it or not, can be undone in the pandemic, because really now the focus is on delivery, and you sort of say every time you connect with someone in a call, it's really around what is the deliverable, what are we supposed to do, what is the outcome for this. Really take those moments to connect. When you have business meetings, let them really be meetings that require people to actually join in. So that really, when you then have these sessions where people can really collaborate, etc., also encourage employees to call each other off on offline. It doesn't have to be done where everybody's brought into a quorum. Just ensure that you're creating an environment that people can continue to stay connected in that area. There's also other stuff that you can do. If people are working from home, spend some time, do a bit of research, give them tips. If you're working from home, sometimes there's a tendency to want to replace the lost commuting time that we've commuted, especially somewhere like Lagos, where traffic is rife.
I know, right?
It's like, oh my God, I can finally sleep. I don't have to wake up at 5. But actually, if you look at the research, you should wake up at the time that you normally would wake up, get your head prepared, separate the space that you're working in, etc. So do a bit of research, get those tips, and share them with your employees so that they are actually in a better headspace. The reality is engagement, productivity, mental health, mental well-being are all interlinked. There's so many bodies of research that support the fact that an employee in good mental health will be a productive employee, will also be an engaged employee. So you really want to keep those lines of correlation going.
Okay, so so you're saying now that routines help to keep you productive in some sort of way, right? So you want to wake up at the right time and do the normal morning routine so that you can have a good start for the day, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So I just asking again to leave us with best practices to position the workforce for COVID and post-COVID era.
So there's a lot of things. I don't know that it's best practice. I think what is just probably because right now to say best practice means that people already know
what's going on. Okay.
In a pandemic. But I think if I were to sort of summarize for employers, I would say recognize that this is a difficult time for your employees. Be very clear that your employees can see that there is a bit of empathy, that you're showing empathy. So you're supporting the well-being of your employees, your line managers, and everybody that works throughout the hierarchy of your organization. Pay attention to changes in productivity, upwards or downwards. Not always an indication that things are going well, even when it's upward. So really look at that and listen to the pulse of your organization to say what is changing and why is that changing. Invest in some training. And when I say invest, it doesn't always mean money. This is the world that we live in 2020 is full of free resources. So spend some time and curate a few resources for few people, especially when they're in leadership positions, they're leading teams, so that they're able to identify when there are mental health challenges, but they're also able to be better managers. We've seen two types of managers evolve from this pandemic. Managers who want to know what you're doing every time, who are showing a significant lack of trust. And we all know that psychological experiment around people become what you expect them to be. So that's not the right intention. And we've seen managers who have allowed employees to thrive, who have stayed connected with them, giving them a purpose and continuity of work, but allow them to be flexible. So really focus on building that type of leadership within your organization. Provide support where you can, including bereavement support. There's some things, and I'll touch on that a little bit. There's some things that we consider taboo, but the reality is people have lost loved ones. And, we always think about loved ones in terms of my father, my mother, my in-laws, my cousins. It's not anyone close, but people have lost ex-colleagues or lost people within their network. And because we're seeing multiplicity of that, it is having its impact. Every time you hear someone has died, it has a different impact than it would have had in a different situation. So that bereavement support, again, free resources. The other thing is physically reduce the exposure at work. Identify all the risks linked to normal work activity, but more importantly, linked to this current pandemic, and control those risks. Try to mitigate those risks and give your employees that assurance that you have made for them a very safe working environment. The other thing is stay connected. I think in this particular time, you can't over communicate. Ensure people know where the business is going, what the business is witnessing within this period of what is happening, and ensure that they understand what they're contributing in terms of the value that they're bringing into the business. So I think generally, really just staying connected with your employees, making sure that you're making arrangements for mental health, mental well-being beyond just being a responsible employer, but making active and proactive steps in investing in mental well-being. And then I think finally ensuring that people understand where the business is and what they're contributing to the business survival.
Okay, but Onyeka, do you think that it is realistic in Nigeria at the moment for an employee to let their employer know about their mental health issues, given the stigma surrounding all of this? And I mean, is it really realistic to do this?
To be honest with you, it's a really good question, and it's one I struggle with because I think I wrote a paper at last 2 months ago about this. The way we see mental health in Nigeria is highly stigmatized. So it's something that people really struggle to share. But the reality is, 1 in every 4 persons in this world at some point will struggle with mental health. That is very, very high odds. The reality is, if you step into a room of 10 people, there's 2.5 people at some point in their lives that have struggled with it. And I think employees will struggle as long as they don't see that as a space where they can have that conversation. So it's really creating an enabling environment, and not just as a tick box exercise. Don't say we have employee assistance programs. Oh, by the way, we're training people on mental health. I think your intent in this situation is far more important than what you do. If I can, and employees can see this, if I can see the intent is really to listen, then I'm actually more likely to share, okay, these are the challenges that I'm currently experiencing, and this is where I need help. And you need to follow that up. There's sometimes when someone asks you a question and when you're answering, they've gone off. And that always is a big no-no. You really want a situation where you've created an environment and you follow up, right? Making that investment and making sure that people know this is a space where you can be comfortable. And it starts with your intent as an employer, but more importantly, because you can have the best vision, the people that you put in positions of leadership need to reflect that intent.
Okay, so there's a question from another viewer. He says that his productivity peaked at the beginning of the pandemic, but now it's dropped. And over the last 2 months, he's thinking that his supervisors have been really hard on him. He says he wants to know if he needs a new job, or that he's just mentally exhausted, or he's being unrealistic. I mean, so what would you advise this person?
I don't think you're being unrealistic. If anything, if you plot those zigzag of feelings across the research that I referred to, that both McKinsey and Deloitte did, you probably are plotting on it, right? At the beginning, everyone was quite, the productivity went high. Everyone was putting everything on board. But I don't know if you've heard the statement, "A rolling stone gathers no moss." And when I think of it, is you quickly run out of steam because you're doing unusual things in an unusual environment, requiring a lot of you physically, mentally, and emotionally. And you're a human being. We're African, but we're not made of rock. We're made of sort of flesh and blood, and you have to be aware of that. So I think a lot of people have said, okay, I need to take some leave now. And my initial thinking was, you're working from home, why are you taking leave? You're at home anyway. But actually, you need to mentally shut off. So I think the point I made earlier, you need to think about, how am I working? Am I allowing that fluidity between my work and home life, especially if you're working from home, where I don't know where work starts and where work ends? So if you can't take time off, I think my biggest suggestion would be that you take time off to rest, relax, and think not of work. If you have that, if you are able to do that, and you can afford to do that in terms of your own setup. If you can't, then really build in some structure in terms of separating your work and your home life, physically and mentally. So if you normally log on your bed, stop that. Do it in your kitchen. Make sure that you separate those physical environments. If you would normally start responding at midnight because that's when you're awake, stop that. Protect the space where you can really unwind, because it's like a phone battery, right? If you charge it and then not charge it and then charge it, it's never really optimal. What you need to do is charge it for a period of time where it's really allowing itself to replenish, and then bring it back strong so that it can get depleted again. And so you need to sort of apply that to your own self, where you really inject discipline in terms of how you're working. It's very difficult because you're working from home, you're under a lot of stress, but I assure you that investment will pay off.
Mm-hmm. So separate your work life from your official duties, your work responsibilities. It's really crucial in these times that we're dealing with. Onyeka Aghatise, thank you so much for joining us, and we're glad to have had you here.
Thank you. I enjoyed the conversation. Have a good day.
Have a good day too. Thank you everyone for joining in this conversation. We'll be back again same time next week for more just discussions on the effect of the pandemic in Nigeria. Have a great time, everyone. Bye.